So, I think we are. Right, my name's Chris Knight. I work here. I'm a research fellow here. I haven't always taught here. I spent 20 years teaching at the University of East London, but this place here, UCL, has always been my centre of gravity. I did my diploma here, I learned anthropology here, and I love being here. And for those of you who don't know, the question we address here in this anthropology department is just one question all the time. All of us are addressing one question, just one. But it's a big question. What does it mean to be human? And we attempt to answer that question by looking at all the different ways there are of looking after children, of respecting the sacred, of organising kinship, of organising economic, all the different ways of being human there are in all the different parts of the world. The Western way of doing things, where a kid has one mummy and one daddy, instead of hundreds of mummies and hundreds of daddies, is a particular way of being human, but it's just one way. Another route through which we address the question, what does it mean to be human, is to ask what might it mean to be a very intelligent creature, maybe a relative of ours, like a gorilla or a chimpanzee, and see to what extent we might say their intelligence, their politics, their sex lives, their way of being, how close is that to what we think of as being human and how distant. So we get a kind of leverage on what it means to be human by asking what it might mean to be kind of nearly but not quite human. Chimpanzees will put it the other way around. They might think we're nearly chimpanzee but not quite chimpanzee, but we're humans. So we tend to look at it that way around. Another whole way of addressing the question, what does it mean to be human, is to look at the past. How do we become what we call modern humans? That means not archaic humans, that means not necessarily Australopithecus or Homo habilis or Homo erectus or the Neanderthals, but all humans across the planet. We're all what paleontologists and paleoanthropologists call modern Homo sapiens. And we're all that, but it's also interesting to ask what might it have been like to be, say, Homo erectus, or maybe a Neanderthal. So that's what we do. And of course, within that question, what does it mean to be human, absolutely central is the fact that humans come in two kinds, only one of which can get pregnant. So often you'll find stories about human origins, about man the hunter, man the toolmaker, man the thinker, man this, man the other, that kind of collapse the female into the male. So a woman's as good as a man, why don't we just talk about men, kind of thing. And that happens very often, you'll find, if you look at narratives of human origins. And here at UCL we don't think that's any use at all. It really is significant that we come in two kinds, male and female, and in terms of our bodies, of course, we're different. And most evolutionary biologists would say that the different bodies mean also different strategies. Far too often we assume that male dominance, patriarchy, is natural. It's a very widespread belief that you can change this, you can change that, you can change legislation, you can change property ownership, you can change politics, but not even the most profound legislative program, maybe not even Jeremy Corbyn, or not even a revolution, could change human nature. Human nature is just given to us. You've got 4 fingers and a thumb on each hand, and maybe the dominance of the male over the female, the male's stronger, maybe more capable of violence, more violence. There may be deep reasons why patriarchy is kind of natural. Just a little bit of information. The primate relatives, if you like, the chimpanzees that are most closely related to us, well, there's common chimpanzees, of course, but there's also what used to be called pygmy chimpanzees, or we now call them bonobos, and I imagine a lot of you know this. Bonobos are female dominated. Okay, so what happens is that females, they're not even related. What they do, they're very interested in sex. So what happens is a female meets another female, and they could start fighting over food or something. And in fact, actually, sometimes 2 female bonobos will catch a small antelope, and they'll keep it to themselves because the males will try to eat what they've got. And what happens is that the females, it's like, if it moves, have sex with it. The females could fight and compete over some resource, and instead of that, they lie back and they put the genitals together and they have a nice rub. and it's called Gigi rubbing. And when they've done the Gigi rubbing, they feel really bonded, and then they don't fight. And what they do then is that because they're bonded, they can beat up any male, and they're kind of matriarchal for that reason. I'm just putting that in there as a little bit of information from primatology, because I do think it's sort of relevant to the question whether matriarchy ever existed. The answer is, well, it still exists among the primates that are very closely related to us. The bonobos are actually probably more intelligent than common chimpanzees, much less violent, they don't have warfare, all kinds of reasons why you might rather be, if you're a human, living with bonobos than with common chimpanzees, who are very despotic, hierarchical, territorial, I mean, I don't want to talk too much about politics, but you can imagine some American politicians that might be possibly compared with chimpanzees. They're very interested in defense and being number one and all that stuff. All of us humans, we would hate to live in a chimpanzee social system, but living with bonobos, we may not want quite as much sex as they get up to. Might be a bit tired of it. But we would probably be a lot happier. Anyway, that's just a point, a brief point about primates. So what we do here in UCL is we look at human origins, as well as human cultural, social, psychological variability. And maybe I should just give you a sort of quick answer to the question, did matriarchy ever exist? What we think, what we in the Radical Anthropology Group think, and what a lot of us here at UCL Department of Anthropology think, is that actually we were for about 100,000 years hunter-gatherers. Hunter-gatherers are the most egalitarian people on Earth. They're assertively egalitarian. They're kind of communistic in the sense that nobody can get any property, or nobody can accumulate property, because everyone else will immediately demand it. It's called demand sharing. And absolutely crucially, egalitarianism is gender egalitarianism. Women have an enormous amount of solidarity and power, at least among African hunter-gatherers. I sort of stress African hunter-gatherers because African hunter-gatherers live closer to the way we used to live, because they live in, and it's not so much true now, but there are still areas in Africa where you still get zebras and giraffe and big game animals, rich resources. There's not the kind of scarcity which leads to chronic shortages and competition. And under those circumstances, women have an enormous amount of say, enormous amount of solidarity and power. And one of the editors of this book, Mona Finnegan, who's done work with the Bayaka forest people of the Congo, along with others in this department, Jerome Lewis in particular, she describes what she calls communism in motion. And I'm giving a kind of a quick sample of what I'm going to be saying, and it's kind of this. We now know, and it's not just a theory, we now know that the form of cooperation which made us modern humans was cooperation in childcare. It was collective childcare. I say we know. Anyone that's interested, just read the book. It's Sarah Hrdy, H-R-D-Y, called Mothers and Others. She's the #1 evolutionary anthropologist. She is a feminist. She's a selfish gene feminist. She's one of the pioneers of sociobiology, which means, of course, a lot of feminists get all, oh my God, sociobiology. Surely that's wrong. Surely women's biology is not her destiny. It's not. Sarah Hrdy is brilliant. She stuck to her guns and showed that this modern form of Darwinism actually is brilliantly inspiring for anyone who's a feminist. So, childcare, because of the large brains that humans were evolving, I won't go into the whole story. We had a bit of it last week with Camilla's talk on the origin of art. What happens is that chimpanzee females, they're all single mothers. A chimpanzee female is a single mum. She has to be a single mum because she's had to move out of her local group into a neighbouring group where she hasn't got any relatives. She dare not let anyone else hold her baby. They could kill her. She doesn't trust anyone with her baby. So now, because she is a single mum without any support, there's pressure on her to have babies who are less burdensome, more precocious, develop more quickly, require less carrying around and less high quality food, and for all those reasons are less encephalized, is the way we put it. They have smaller brains. There's a kind of limit to the amount of brain size you can afford in your baby if you can't get support in childcare. So what we now know, and it's not controversial, this part of the talk, not controversial at all, is that as the first stage of encephalization was occurring in Homo erectus, women with these extra burdens of childcare, because their babies were large-brained and slow maturing and therefore more burdensome, what women did was live with mum. And it's called the grandmother hypothesis. So essentially women would draw on the support of the one person in the world who they can most rely on for consistent, reliable support in childcare. That's mum. It's still the case today, isn't it? If you really want brilliant childcare support and you're a woman, you go to your mum. You can trust your mum with one. Maybe you, I see a lot of people shaking their head. Oh my God! So capitalism's even destroyed that. Anyway, all right. All I'm saying is that in the evolutionary past, you could rely on mum. But what it meant was you had to live with mum. Okay, and if you're living with mum, you're living with mum's other children, including your sisters. And so to start with, what happens is that women are looking after not just their own children, but their daughters' children. And this is called the grandmother hypothesis, and it explains menopause. So why is it that human females live long after the years of reproduction? It's because it makes more sense. If you keep having babies until you're 80 or 90, you might die before, and the baby's going to be in real trouble. But if you, at the later stages of life, you're looking after your daughter's children, from a Darwinian point of view, an evolutionary point of view, that makes a lot of sense. And your daughter's kids, of course, there's no question that they're going to be related to you. And then what happens is that the coalitions, the alliances formed for childcare purposes between females, a point is arrived at much more recently. This is now about 500,000 years ago, maybe even more recent. When the alliances which women have, they discover they can use their solidarity for a completely new and revolutionary purpose. They can actually get the males to pull their weight. First time ever. Okay, now, it sounds like a bit of a joke, but if you imagine a gorilla male going out and getting food and bringing it back to mummy and the kids, forget it. They're never going to do that. It might happen with robins and other birds and stuff. It doesn't happen with primates. The males are, I won't say useless, but we would consider them useless. They provide you with sperm, which you need, of course, to get pregnant, and not a huge amount else. And we had Camilla talking about that last week, Camilla Power, the editor of this book. But what evolving human females did in the second stage of brain encephalization, so, okay, chimpanzees have a brain size of about 350 cubic centimeters. About 2 million years ago, when we find the first tools being made, that's gone up to about 900 or 1,000. And then the last increase in brain size has been almost exponential. It shoots up to 3 times the size of a chimpanzee brain, or even more. And that last spurt of increase in brain size, you couldn't explain it unless you knew, okay, mothers are now tapping into resources from a new place. They're actually tapping into the spare capacity of the evolving human male. They're making the male kind of earn his keep, not just provide you with sperm and then move on and get somebody else pregnant, but hang around a bit and actually provide some provisioning support. How did females do that? Well, they had to make sex dependent on good behavior. So badly behaved males come up against a coalition of females which just say, you're no use to us, we're not interested, go away and look for sex somewhere else, you're not going to get it around here. I've cut a huge long story short. Okay, that's the sex strike theory of human origins, which I've been pursuing for a long time. I'm not going to talk too much about that this evening, but because we're going to move on to some maybe hopefully more juicy and interesting. Anyway, what I've done is I've given you a sort of brief overview. The crucial point is that for hunter-gatherers, women are not, the idea that, I know, in order to be liberated you have to get out of childcare. No, you don't have to. You do under patriarchy, of course you do, But hunter-gatherers actually made childcare the collective powerhouse of society. The whole society revolved around getting the next generation up and running. The place where childcare was happening was a collective space. It was the place where the stories were told, where relationships were formed, And women were in charge of the major rituals, the most important rituals. It actually, as it so happens, happened to be around first menstruation. So among all African hunter-gatherers, the most important ritual is a girl's first menstruation ritual ceremony, and women are in charge of that whole ritual. And we may think, what's rituals got to do with it? What's ceremonies got to do with it? I'm sorry, for hunter-gatherers, rituals and ceremonies are, if you like, the Houses of Parliament. I mean, rituals and ceremonies are the places where power is mobilised, where things get done. And if women are in charge of those ceremonies, that makes them, in some ways, the ruling sex. But and I was mentioning Morna Finnegan, her idea of communism in motion, very briefly. What she points out is that there's never been, with hunter-gatherers, a time when women rule in a sort of one-sided, permanent way. What happens rather is that women playfully take the power. Women playfully organise a ceremony. We've got evidence of that. Still happens in Africa, parts of Africa today, where women seize control over the whole space of the camp in a playful, joyful ritual. And the men are kind of, in a way, scared of what the women are getting up to now. The women are very, very powerful. They're very teasing. They're full of laughter, and they're teasing their men's various sexual attributes and stuff. And the women kind of take over and rule for a period, several days. And then the women get a bit bored with this, and they think, okay, what about giving up on all this? Letting the men have their turn. Because if we do that, if we let the men come in and take over the camp with their rituals, we'll have the pleasure of overthrowing the men all over again. So it's like the women aren't happy with just one revolution. They want to have another one, and another one, and another one. And of course, you can only keep taking the power repeatedly. And actually, what originally it was to a lunar rhythm, you can only keep taking the power repeatedly if you're prepared to surrender power. So maybe there's a lesson there, and I think there is a lesson actually, which we could apply to politics today. It's great to seize power, but it's very important to know how to let go as well. But that's kind of politics, and I've got to keep out of politics as far as I can, as much as I can. Otherwise, I get into trouble. Right now, again. Inevitably, these things are controversial, and it's not always the case that things are controversial because they're debatable, questionable, or whatever. Sometimes things are controversial because they upset the authorities. One of the things we have to remember is that all of our universities were once theological colleges, and a lot of the theology is sort of still around, maybe not so visibly, but it's kind of there as part of the tradition. So for anyone to say that women could be powerful, and that women could be powerful not despite biology, but thanks to being female, that seems to go against, I don't know, it's a kind of politically difficult to say that without being accused of being political. So what I want to do to start with is to just give you a bit of a taste of what happened around the turn of the last century, towards the end of the 90s, around the end of the 19th century, the turn of the 20th century. So let me just say, in the last decades of the 19th century, all anthropologists, just about, but not just all anthropologists, pretty much all savants, all writers, philosophers, people like Freud, people like Sir James Fraser, they all agreed that once upon a time the family had been the matriarchal clan. That originally the family was matrilineal, it was female descent. You didn't have nuclear families, you didn't have like the man at the head of a household. You had something much closer to what Frederick Engels described, following Lewis Henry Morgan, among the Native Americans of the New York region, the Iroquois. You had a long house, a big house, with all the women related, in charge of the different fires, and they would be running the distribution system, organising politics, supporting each other, backed up by their brothers, and getting men from neighbouring long houses to visit them as lovers. But those men wouldn't belong. The women would just say, well, if you want rights and belonging, like a right to a meal, go back to your mum, go back to your sister's house. You can come here, stay the night. You know, we'll be nice to you as long as you make sure you bring some provisions, maybe bring a game animal. But the system is a matrilineal one, which meant that those men wouldn't have rights in the household into which they'd married, and therefore wouldn't have rights in their children. Or rather, they would have rights in children, but their children would be their sister's children, of course, because they would belong in their mother's and sister's house. So until around 1900, just about all, not just anthropologists, but nearly every philosopher, in one way or another, accepted that theory, that before patriarchy, you had matriarchy, right? And then what happened was the First World War. And what happened was that, whereas in the 19th century, these largely men who wrote anthropology books, they all felt very comfortable, very secure. They knew that Victorian man was the pinnacle of evolution. They might agree that maybe some savages in some part of the world had some kind of communistic habits, and maybe they even had sexual communism, and maybe even let women rule them, but it doesn't really matter because they were savages. And we've moved out of savagery and we've become civilized. So there was this profound assumption that nothing that hunter-gatherer people did could possibly threaten the Victorian family, or in this case, in this part of the world, the British Empire. And then you had the First World War. And suddenly everything felt much, much less stable. And the figure who came to the fore in this country, who was teaching down at London School of Economics, was the founder of anthropology in its modern form. His name was Bronislaw Malinowski. I'm sure a lot of you might have heard of him. And he complained that even in his own home, he felt threatened now by feminism. So he was saying that even in our own homes, we no longer feel secure. The First World War had destabilizing everything. There's all kinds of socialists and suffragettes around demanding rights for women. Feminists were, demanding all kinds of things, and complaining about male behaviour in all kinds of different ways. And in particular, Malinowski felt very, very worried about the very idea that you could have a matrilineal clan, the very idea that motherhood, childcare, could be collective. Okay? I'm going to, because some people think I'm exaggerating, I'm going to read out from his actual words. So this is the founder of modern anthropology, Bronislaw Malinowski. A whole school of anthropologists, from Beethoven on. Beethoven was the author of this book in the mid-19th century called Mutterrecht, Mother Right. A whole school of anthropologists from Beethoven on have maintained that the maternal clan was the primitive domestic institution. In my opinion, as you know, this is entirely incorrect. But an idea like that, once it is taken seriously and applied to modern conditions, becomes positively dangerous. I believe, this is of course after the Russian Revolution, I believe that the most disruptive element in the modern revolutionary tendencies is the idea that parenthood could be made collective. If once we came to the point of doing away with the individual family as the pivotal element of our society, we should be faced with a social catastrophe compared with which the political upheaval of the French Revolution and the economic changes of Bolshevism are insignificant. Purple in the face now. The question, therefore, as to whether group motherhood is an institution which ever existed, whether it is an arrangement which is compatible with human nature and social order, is of considerable practical interest. And he made it his mission, his scholarly duty, if you like, because he'd by now become a sort of moral advisor to society as the leading anthropologist of the day. He denounced feminist ideology and saw it as his scholarly duty to, quote, prove to the best of my ability that marriage and the family have been, are, and will remain the foundations of human society. So there you are. Here's your dispassionate scholarship. Here's your objective scientist, exploring what it means to be human and exploring the history of the family. Real practical political issues were at stake. And no way was the establishment now going to even acknowledge the possibility of women's solidarity, women's power, anything remotely like feminism, certainly not collective child care, being compatible with human nature. And so you had this dogma that the nuclear family, at the head of which was the patriarch, the individual male, married to his wife as his belonging, was the foundation of all human culture and order, and was inherited by our ancestors from their primate precursors. So the idea was that monogamy is like what all monkeys and apes do, it's part of human nature, part of primate nature. Monogamy, nuclear family, you can't change it. So you feminists, come on, you're up against human nature now. That's the idea, and you socialists. Right, okay, I maybe made my point, which is that these things can be controversial. Are you sort of with me? Is it all making a bit of sense? If that was controversial, you can imagine how controversial our stuff here at UCL is. Because we're going quite a bit further than just the idea that parenthood can be made collective. I just thought maybe I would, how much longer have we got? We've got another half hour of the talk. Okay, I thought that maybe I would, I'm not going to read this, but I'm going to look at my notes, because one of the people that I made contact with quite a while ago, in the early 80s actually, was Tim Buckley, and he was the editor with Alma Gottlieb of a book that I contributed to. And if you're interested, it's called Blood Magic. Blood Magic, the Anthropology of Menstruation. Menstruation. It's really difficult to use that word, menstruation, as a man. People get really worried about it. As I said, these universities were theological colleges not so long ago, and although Jesus' blood and the blood of sacrifice and all the Leviticus stuff is okay, women's blood is very, very worrying. Okay, so that book, Blood Magic, sort of helped break the mold, and my book as well, Blood Relations, went a bit further. Yeah, perhaps I should just preface this by just saying, go to a hunter-gatherer society in Africa. My partner, Camilla Powers, worked with the Hadza, these are in Tanzania, bow and arrow hunters. Almost the last hunter-gatherers anywhere in the world who still live hunting with bows and arrows live the way in which our species evolved to live, hunting big game animals on the savannah. Okay, and I can just tell you now, menstruation is just an enormously important factor in life. It's not a taboo in the way that menstruation is a taboo in our culture. In our culture, it's a hugely internalized taboo. It's so internalized that you can't even talk about it hardly. Even as far as I can work out, I've been told many women aren't too comfortable talking about it. With the Hadza, for a start, all the men believe, because the women help them believe, that all the women synchronize their menstrual periods and bleed together every dark moon. In practice, if you ask, Camilla asked the women just say, oh well, it's nice that the men believe this, it helps us, and there's an element of truth in it, but it's not quite true that every woman is in synchrony with every other woman. But it's certainly true that when the blood is flowing, or believed to be flowing, do you know what it does? It's like disarmament. It takes the weapons from men. How does it do that? How can menstrual blood take away male violence, take away in this case, their poisoned arrows? It's just that men believe that if they have their poisoned arrows anywhere near a woman who's menstruating, the poison will be annihilated. It won't work. And a man who's got poisoned arrows that don't work, it's like he feels, in the women's eyes, well, call yourself a man, what did you last bring us a zebra? So, can you see what's happening? The menstrual blood is constructed to disarm men. Men can't be carrying weapons around women when they're menstruating. And the men fear that that's because of the effect of the blood on the arrow poison. Now that's not just that one group that had it. You'll find all across Africa there's this belief about the extraordinary potency of the blood of women. But I wanted to read you something from a different culture, a different area. And it's Tim Buckley, the man I mentioned before, who got in contact with me, who describes the menstrual traditions of the Yurok Indians who live in northwest California, close to the Klamath River. So one evening in 1978, he was invited to the house of a local informant for a meal. And Buckley's male friend explained that he'd be doing the cooking since his wife was on her moon time. They were living in quite big bungalows, and there's a woman's half of the bungalow and the other half. And so his wife, Buckley was told, his informant's wife was on her moon time in her menstrual period, and they were keeping the old ways, the traditional ways, as best they could. And the back room had been set apart in the modern house for his wife's monthly use. So anyway, this woman emerged from her room to talk with the anthropologist about what she was doing and how she felt about it. She had been instructed in the menstrual laws by her maternal aunts and grandmother, who were in their times well-known conservative Yurok ladies. And she began her account by telling Buckley that as a foster child in non-Indian houses, she had been taught that menstruation is bad and shameful, and that through it women are being punished. And then she returned to her own traditional village. My aunt and my grandmother taught me different. According to the old traditions, a woman should seclude herself during her flow because, quotes, this is the time when she is at the height of her powers. Such time should not be wasted in mundane tasks and social distractions, nor with the opposite sex. Rather, did someone say something? No. Sorry. Rather, all of one's energies should be applied in concentrated meditation to find out the purpose of your life. It is a time for the accumulation of spiritual energy, the flowing blood serving to purify the woman and prepare her for spiritual accomplishment. So when you're menstruating, that's the time when you should be in charge of your own time. You shouldn't be hassled. Nobody should ask you for sex or a meal or whatever else. It's your special time, and it's a time when you can think about the meaning of life in general. In the old days, menstruating women used to commonly bathe and perform rituals in a sacred moontime pond up in the mountains above the old Yurok village. All of a household's fertile women who were not pregnant menstruated at the same time, a time dictated by the moon. And this is in quotes, but it's the woman explaining this. That everyone menstruated at the same time, going up to this sacred moontime pond at the same time, according to the phases of the moon. If a woman got out of phase with the moon and with the other women of the household, she could get back in, balance your cycle, if you like, by sitting in the moonlight and talking to the moon, asking it to balance her. Through the ritual bathing practice and by maintaining synchrony with wider rhythms, women came to see that the earth has her own moon time, a recognition that made one both stronger and proud of one's menstrual cycle. Perhaps I want you to just think about this. I just invite you to imagine a world made for women instead of a world made for people who don't have periods. I mean, our world is made for one sex, basically. Women are supposed to fit in, and obviously women are incredibly resilient and manage to fit in. But just imagine a world where you didn't have these watches and clocks. I call those time is money clocks. If you're not making money, if you're enjoying sex, enjoying playing with your kids, enjoying gardening, enjoying your allotment, I don't know, anything else you're enjoying really, you're probably wasting time. You could be making money. And these clocks were invented to keep us to that rule. So imagine the clocks weren't these ones. Every woman has got that clock in her body. Okay? Now imagine further, this is the difficult bit. Imagine that those clocks in the female body, in the body of half the human species, could connect. It sounds a bit strange, maybe very unlikely, but just imagine it. I'm just asking you to fantasize a bit. A thought experiment, if you like. Imagine the menstrual clock was the equivalent of these clocks in the sense that that clock was the one which made the world go round, which decided the alternation between work and play. And it did it because the clock could be phase locked with the moon. So up in the sky we've got two clocks, haven't we? We've got the sun And these clocks are based on that, really. All of our timekeeping is now based on solar measurements, not the moon. You will notice, however, that all the world's religions, even to this day, their festivals, Islam, Judaism, even Easter with Christians, are still connected to the older, in many ways more important ritual clock, which of course is the moon. Now you might say, and I know you will say, and it's true, that science has told us, and it is true. It's one of these things which I get accused of. I say, Chris, you're just making things up. You're telling us that because women have a 29.5 day length of cycle, that's got something to do with the moon. And they said, Chris, don't you get it? It's just a coincidence. It really is just a coincidence. And I come back and say, well, I agree, it could be just a coincidence. Okay? But why not explore whether or not in the evolutionary past there was some adaptive advantage in the course of human evolution, some adaptive advantage in women being able to synchronize with one another using the moon as their clock. So what I point out then, I just say, chimpanzees, common chimpanzees, they have a 36-day cycle. I said earlier nice things about bonobos. They have a 40-day cycle. Gibbons have a 28-day cycle. Actually, orangutans have a 29-day cycle. So it's pretty close to 29.5 days. Do you know what the figure 29.5 days means? Or is? It's exactly the time it takes for the moon to pass through its phases as seen from the Earth. And I agree that that correspondence, could be just a coincidence. But before we dismiss it as of no significance, why not explore whether there could be some reason why you would have that length of menstrual cycle? I mean, is that fair enough? Just explore it, okay? Just think about it. Now again, what was happening around the time that this book, Blood Magic, was being published was that an American scientist published something in Nature. Her name was Martha McClintock. And she'd noticed the fact that female lifeguards and many other women who lived together and worked together would sometimes synchronize their menstrual periods. And she introduced the whole concept of menstrual synchrony into the sort of gynecological, at least medical vocabulary. And Thomas Buckley, who wrote this stuff on the Yurok, he made a link. He said, right, these women among the Yurok are telling us that they used to synchronize their periods using the moon as a clock, and now we're being told by the scientists, at least by one scientist, Martha McClintock, that when women have sufficient intimacy and collectivity and solidarity, their cycles tend to synchronize. And of course, when they do tend to synchronize, the women with slightly longer cycles tend to get shorter, and with shorter get longer, until the mean is the closest to 29.5 days. And it is true that with human females today, all the medical measurements show this. The time when your cycle is likely to be closest to 29.5 days is the time of life when there's maximum fertility. So younger girls tend to have a longer cycle. As you get older, it tends to speed up a bit, but around the time when you're most fertile, it's going to be probably closest to 29.5 days. And also, the period of pregnancy is an exact multiple of 29.5. Again, it could all be coincidence, but why not explore whether or not there's some reasons for it. I'm not sure whether you're with me here, because can you sort of, I want to get you on my side with this. It has something to do with matriarchy. In other words, it's got something to do with imagining a world made not just for people that have testicles and penises, but a world made for people of both types of body, if you like. I want you to imagine it. I would have thought it's fairly obvious that if women were running the world, they would probably want clocks which worked for them. Maybe, of course, I'm sure a lot of you know, there are various attempts in various parts of the world to actually have legal right to go on strike during a menstrual period. And actually, they've actually got somewhere in parts of Southeast Asia. They've been, I think, in Vietnam and one or two other places. We've seen it like, okay, women have every right to go on strike once a month, whereas men don't. That's kind of a side issue in a way. Those things are happening today. But what I'm interested in is trying to persuade you that there's some, if you like, we're talking about human nature, okay? And we've been told so often that you can't change human nature. And what I want to come to before too long, that clock's moving a bit, okay, there's this deep assumption in the West, and it's been around for a long time, that although as a woman you can get emancipation, you can get ahead, you can have power and influence, the assumption is that yes, you can do that, but it'll kind of be despite being female. It'll be difficult to reconcile your job, your career, your work in the city, whatever job you've got, you know, with having kids. And it would be probably best if you maybe, I don't know, at least at that time of your life, you don't have kids, or you've had your kids. And also it might be best to take pills, and menstruation, the hormones and things can probably get in the way. And all I'm saying is, a world which is really made for women would be a very different world, where instead of the demand being that you go to work, and you work during your period just like it was any other day, which of course causes some stress, and I think PMS and all those things are probably to do with the kind of stress produced by patriarchy. If instead of that you had the world itself was governed by the moon in the way that hunter-gatherers actually use the moon as their clock. I've got now. Okay, it seems to me this is a question. First of all, I've asked this question: is male dominance natural? Well, you'll be hard pressed to find a traditional horticultural or hunter-gatherer culture which thinks it's natural. On the contrary, and I'm now going to be beginning the topic of mythology, you'll find that in precisely those areas of the world, I'm talking now about not cities, not developed areas, I'm talking about gardening cultures, maybe Papua New Guinea, Aboriginal Australia, many parts of Amazonia, many parts of Africa, where men have a monopoly on ritual power. Okay, so the men have got a big men's house. There's a big men in Papua New Guinea with all their feathers. I'm sure you've seen pictures. And when women menstruate, they're pushed into the valley, into a funny little hut down there, somewhere in the mud somewhere, and they're isolated in the way that Rachel was saying. Mary is isolated in the stable. Anyway, let's leave out Christianity for the moment. And what you'll find is that wherever men monopolize ritual power, they are terrified that if they were to lose concentration and stop and organize a kind of reign of terror against women, what would happen was this: women would regain their natural ascendancy. They would regain their power. They've got this magic in their bodies. It's something to do with the moon. It casts spells. It's something to do with their blood. And if we don't keep women down, they will regain the power they once had. Okay. Now I know that's a myth. I understand that. I'm not. Here we do anthropology. We do science. We don't base ourselves on myths. But we're also very interested in myths. And we analyse the myths. We want to know where the myths come from. We want to make our own sense of those myths. So I'm going to read out a few of those myths. Is that all right? And these are called the myth of matriarchy. And so it is actually relevant to this evening's topic. And I have to be careful. I mustn't read out too many. If you want the myths, they're all in my book. And you can cheat. No, you can cheat because there's countless digital copies of this book all over the place. You don't even have to buy the book. It's all over the place. So you can find all these myths in the book. But here's one of them. I'm going to read out a couple. This is from Papua New Guinea, a tribe called the Gimi. Gimi, G-I-M-I. And it's called The Origin of the Sacred Flute. Now, in all these cultures where men monopolize ritual power, they have some musical instrument. It's a trumpet, it's a flute, it's a special drum. Okay, and it symbolizes male rule, male power. And you'll find that in every case, the men say, originally women had this power, and we had to use violence or trickery to steal from women the power which was naturally and originally theirs. So, the origin of the sacred flute. A woman kept the sacred flute under her bark string skirts. So she's keeping the flute between her legs, okay? Until one day it was stolen by her brother. On putting the blowhole to his mouth, however, his sister's pubic hairs attached themselves to the man's face. This is why men today have beards. Great. That's fantastic. Got you all laughing. The loss of her flute caused the woman to menstruate for the first time. Ever afterwards, she was secluded each month in a menstrual hut. The men, meanwhile, began playing the flute inside the men's house and have held power ever since. And if you see a picture of the men's house, it's this magnificent building, magnificent, sturdy building. And the men say this is what women used to live in this building, but now we put the women in these little funny little huts, isolated huts at the bottom of the valley somewhere, and that's where they belong. But it's like, and of course these men's houses, if you trace them back, if you take temples, if you take churches, Radical was talking about Christianity, if you take Chartres, I don't know, Westminster Abbey, take churches and cathedrals, go back and back and back and back and back, you'll find their men's houses, okay? And we know, don't we, that not so long ago, a woman couldn't be a priest in Christianity. I wonder why a woman can't be a priest. I'm telling you now what it is. Honestly, everyone knows this. It's because of the blood. Jesus' blood. You mustn't let it be contaminated. Any other blood, women's blood especially, would just get in the way. It would kind of negate the holiness of this other blood, which is kept sacred. That's one. Okay. Now, what I'm saying is, okay, you go back and back and back and back and back, and you'll find these men's houses of the original temples. But the men say, this is the interesting thing, that this temple originally was women's collective menstrual house, where they went once a month and did sort of magical things, including collectively looking after their kids and performing ceremonies. And the men say that. It's just a myth. Okay, I agree, it's just a myth. Who cares about myths? Well, actually, I'm very interested in myths. I want to know how they got there, and why they take the form they do. I'm going to read another one. This is from Tierra del Fuego, the Yamana. It's called The Origin of the Quina. The Quina is the great male ritual. Remember I said earlier that among African hunter-gatherers, the main rituals, the most important rituals, the ones that make the world go round, the ones that make the game animals plentiful, the ones that ensure success in the hunt, the girl's first menstruation. I said that, remember? These stories are now telling us, and the men are saying this, by the way, they're saying, yes, the main ritual was women's menstrual ceremonies, but luckily we sorted all that out, and we took these things from women. So here we are. The origin of the Quina, Tierra del Fuego, Yamana tribe. In the beginning, women had sole power. They gave orders to the men who obeyed, just as women do today. The men took care of the children, tended the fire and cleaned the skins, while the women did no work in the hut at all. So you've got these lazy women just lying back and getting the men to do all the labour, including the childcare. That was the way it was always to be. The women invented the great Quina hut and everything which goes on inside it, and then fooled the men into thinking they were spirits. So can you see what's happening? The women were the sort of priestesses. The women were fooling the men, it's all a big trick of course, into thinking that some kind of divine spirits were involved in these proceedings inside these big huts. Well, that's what priests always do. You do various things in cathedrals and whatever it is. Now, the women stepped out of the great hut, painted all over, with masks on their heads. The men did not recognize their wives, who, simulating the spirits, beat the earth with dried skins so that the earth shook. Their yells, howls, and roars so frightened the men that they hastened into their huts and hid, full of fear. Then, one day, the sun man, notice sun. The sun's always treated as the antidote to the moon. Men have got the sun, women have got the moon, and the sun has to win, as far as men are concerned. Anyway, one day the sun man, who supplied the women's spirits in the Quina hut with an abundance of game, he overheard the voices of two girls while he was passing a lagoon. Being curious, he hid in the bushes and saw the girls washing off painting, which was characteristic of the spirits when they appeared. These girls had also been practicing their imitations of the voices of the spirits. Suddenly, the sun man confronted them, insisting that they reveal to him what went on in the Quina hut. Finally, the girls confessed to him, "It is the women themselves who paint themselves and put on masks. Then they step out of the hut and show themselves to the men. There are no other spirits there. It is the women themselves who yell and howl. In this way, they frighten the men." So the men are saying that when the women did all this religious stuff, it was all a deceptive trick. It was just women, just our wives, after all. What spirits are they, So anyway, to carry on, the sun man then returned to the camp and exposed the fraudulent women. In revenge, the men stormed the Kina hut, and a great battle ensued in which the women were either killed or transformed into animals. From that time on, the men had performed in the Kina hut. They do this in the same manner as the women before them. So the men are saying everything we do is an exact replica of what women did, and they use that as justification. Okay, we were pretty violent to the women, we exploited them, all that stuff frightening, but don't forget, women are very dangerous, and they would do it to us if we let them. That's the men's claim.
Except the men killed the women.
Oh yeah.
And continue to kill the women.
Yes. Yeah, that's right. That's patriarchy. It's rather an extreme form, I have to admit. Okay, anyway, right, let's move on. Now, another nice one, which gives you the sort of sexual dimensions of it all, the origin of the bull roarer, from another Papua New Guinea group, the Kwavuru. I'm only going to give you a few of these, in fact, no, only another two, so hold on. Tiv, the originator, this is the kind of original creator spirit, or trickster, okay, Tiv, was puzzled to hear a faint sound like that of a bull roarer whenever his wife moved. Now, does everyone know what a bull roarer is? You whirl it round, you woo, 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 makes a huge noise. If you hear 20 bull roarers, it sounds like an aeroplane engine revving up in your living room. And it's what Aboriginal Australian men use to signify their ritual power. It's the roaring of the dragon, in their case the rainbow snake. And in many parts of the world you have these bull roarers, which are the sound-making instruments, emblematic of the rule of men, the power of men. So Tiv, the originator, was puzzled to hear a faint sound, just like that of a bull roarer, whenever his wife moved. He asked her what the sound was, but she pretended not to know. Eventually, Tiv felt sure that it was coming from her vagina, and he commissioned various birds to steal the object responsible. A number of birds swooped down at her while, with bent back and legs spread wide apart, the woman was engaged in sweeping the village. So every time she bends over, this bird tries to snatch this bull roarer from between the legs. But each time she frustrated them by abruptly sitting down. Only the parrot got near enough to draw blood. This is why parrots' feathers are red. Eventually, Tiv called upon the little bird called Serikute and threatened it with death if he failed to obtain the sound-making instrument. Tiv shouted to his wife, "Show a little bit more rigour in your sweeping." And as she bent down and the point of the bull roarer protruded from her vagina, the bird swooped down and snatched it away. The woman lay streaming with her first menstrual flow while Tiv hugged the bull roarer to his breast and declared that henceforth it will belong to man alone, showing that this power that men have has got something to do with women's intimate secrets. We'll be dealing with this whole topic in a bit more detail next week, because the Aboriginal myths about the origin of fire claim that women had fire, monopolised it, used it for their own purposes, and every time a man approached, they would put the fire stick up their vagina, and the men wouldn't know where it was.
Vagina is a very, very patriarchal word. It means a sheep.
I'm sorry, I'm going to use the word cunt. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. I feel I'm corrected. Cunt. I'm a cunt. Okay, thank you. Quite right. Absolutely. That's the proper word. Okay, now the last one is this one. The origin of the sacred flutes. Daruya, Papua New Guinea. And I'm reading out this last one. Don't worry, after this, no more myths. We're going to stop in a minute. But this one is like the killer. So, in the days of the dream time, that's the distant past which is sort of always present, the past which you can make present if you perform the rituals right. In the days of the dream time, the women one day invented flutes. They played them and drew wonderful sounds from them. The men listened and did not know what made those sounds. One day a man hid to spy on the women and discovered what was making those melodious sounds. He saw several women, one of whom raised a piece of bamboo to her mouth and drew the sounds that the men had heard. Then the woman hid the bamboo beneath one of her skirts that she had hung in her house, which was a menstrual hut. The woman then left. The man drew near, slipped into the hut, searched around, found the flute and raised it to his lips. He too brought forth the same sounds. Then he put it back and went to tell the other men what he had seen and done. When the woman returned, she took out her flute to play it, but this time the sounds which she drew were ugly. So she threw it away, suspecting that the men had touched it. Later the man came back, found the flute and played it. Lovely sounds came forth, just like the ones which the woman had made. Since then, the flutes have been used to help boys grow. And in this case, I can't help repeating the words of the ethnographer, because he clearly understood what was going on. And he says, rightly in my view, the message of this myth is clear. In the beginning, women were superior to men, but one of the men, violating the fundamental taboo against ever penetrating into the menstrual hut or touching objects soiled with menstrual blood, captured their power and brought it back to men, who now use it to turn little boys into men. But this power, stolen from the women, is the very one that their vagina contains. Excuse me, I've used the wrong word there, but it's in the book. Like, I can't help it. Don't say come. The one given them by their menstrual blood. The old women know the rough outlines of this myth and relate it to young girls when they're their first period. So that's making very clear that whatever's inside the menstrual hut is the magic which men, and of course you have, all the book stories are making this clear, you have to be such a heroic man to dare get into that space. It's like here, getting to the women's toilet or something, except far worse, of course. To go into the menstrual hut is to risk everything, and yet this hero managed to get away with it. It's like going into the jaws of death and coming out alive, which is exactly what those hero tales are, of course, saying. And I thought, just because I've said I've got a few things now about these stories, I just want to get a little bit, just before we finish, just kind of back to reality. Because there may be skeptics, perhaps some of you are skeptics, who believe that the kind of solidarity between women that I was discussing occurs among the Yurok, or that these myths are alleging women, the myths are alleging that women have this wicked solidarity. They're like a coven of witches casting their spells. And you might think that it kind of doesn't fit anything we know of in reality today. But in 2001, another anthropologist, her name is Wyn Maggie, described in a wonderful book, Our Women Are Free. The men are saying that. Okay, well, we'll go into that perhaps when we have time in questions. Anyway, she describes in the book, Our Women Are Free, what regularly happens to this day inside the bashali, as it's called, a communal menstrual house used by the women among the Kalasha people of northwest Pakistan. And Wyn Maggie was so surprised at what she found that she feared her Western readers might not believe her. And she explains, and you can feel her sort of caution and worry that people are going to think she's, I don't know, making things up or something. I don't want to make the mistake of leading you to believe that women always achieve mystic solidarity simply by virtue of sharing time in the menstrual house. Yet one of the delightful things, for me at least, is that for a few days, women whose paths otherwise rarely cross find things in common. The Bashali is a place of intense physical intimacy where women share knowledge about their bodies that would be unthinkable in everyday life. So her book was called Our Women Are Free because this is something which men say of the women. The women in the Kalasha Valley consider themselves free whether married or not. Men are not just supportive but proud of the fact that their women are free to travel, free once married to return whenever they like to the home where they were born, and most importantly free to resist men's demands whenever they feel like. And in this community there are no isolated menstrual huts. Instead there is a large sacred building serving as a communal meeting house for the women who see it as the physical centre for their solidarity and freedom. Women congregate here when menstruating or giving birth, so that at any one time there may be as many as 20 women inside, gossiping, laughing and singing together, many with their babies and toddlers. During their stay in what they call their most holy place, women compare notes on the duration of their menstrual flows, and the book describes how intimate the women are in this place, that all their secrets are here. They have words for things which the men don't even know the words for women's secrets. And what happens is that any woman who gets a bit fed up with her husband, she'll pretend she's menstruating in order to get back with this wonderful sense of solidarity among these women. And again, if you think this is just one example, I'm sorry, but you just need to study a bit of hunter-gatherer ethnography and maybe come to this evening class. You'll find African hunter-gatherers where they still survive, where they're still doing well, where they've still got plenty of game and everything's working. They don't have temples, they don't have churches, they have mostly grass huts. But the biggest one, which they build specially, I'm now talking about the Mbuti, and the Ituri forest, and Zaire. The biggest one of all is this thing called the Alima house. And into it go all the girls when they're having their period. And the girls are now, especially if it's their first period, they say we are blessed by the moon. And they go into this house, they sing, they're with their mothers and aunts, and having had an intimate time for several days singing, what happens is that all the boys in the neighbourhood get very excited at the news that there's a new girl coming into circulation, and they all kind of stand around outside hoping to get a glimpse of the girls. And what happens is, after a few days of this, suddenly the girls will rush out of the Alima house with these saplings, and they'll chase a boy. And any boy they fancy has got to, once he's been hit with a stick, he's got to come into that big Alima house, and he is initiated. How's he initiated? Well, he has his first sex. And he has his first sex really by being jumped on by a whole bunch of women, which rather again turns the tables on most of our images of how initiation rituals are performed. It's coming up to, well, it's nearly 10 to 8, and what I said was, I'm wondering what to do. What I said was that I'm extremely anxious to know whether so far, I haven't really finished, but I can't keep going on and on and on, whether so far what I've been talking about is roughly what you expected to hear. Robin, give me some advice. Do we want a brief tea break? I mean, there's so many of us, I'm not sure anyone's going to get a single cup of tea.
It's been difficult, the logistics of it. I mean,
can I just have a show of hands? Listen, we've got two choices. We could either have a bit of a break now, 5 minutes for go to the toilet or smoking or something, and then come back. Don't lose your seat, of course. Or we can just go through for another 20 minutes and stop a bit earlier and go to the pub. Hands up for the first option, which was you have a break now. Hands up. Hands up for the second option, which we carry on. Oh, everyone. Okay, that's great. That's fantastic. Okay. So, please, will somebody tell me what it is about this magic word, matriarchy, which gets like 500 people. It's not 500, is it? But it's like, I don't know, what is it? 100?
Facebook said 199.
How did we get on Facebook?